The sound of bone breaking echoes differently when 800 soldiers hear it at once. It carries across parade grounds and through morning air like a rifle shot, sharp and final, cutting through the low hum of military routine with surgical precision. For Captain Maya Strand, standing over Colonel Victor Marlowe as he crumpled to his knees clutching his shattered arm, that sound would define everything that came after. The silence that followed lasted exactly 7 seconds. 7 seconds of absolute stillness where hundreds of pairs of eyes locked onto a scene that would rewrite careers, reshape policy, and force the United States Army to confront questions it had been avoiding for decades. But that moment, frozen in time and memory, was merely the explosion. The fuse had been burning for 18 months. 18 months earlier, September 2021, arrived at Fort Garrison with the kind of heat that makes North Carolina feel like the surface of the sun. The last gasp of summer, refusing to surrender to fall. Captain Maya Strand stepped off the transport bus with her deployment bag slung over one shoulder, her boots hitting tarmac for the first time since her discharge from Walter Reed 3 months prior. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every ribbon on her chest the hard way. 2 tours in Afghanistan as an EOD specialist, explosive ordnance disposal, where mistakes measured in ounces of pressure could end in obliteration. 1 tour in Iraq, building roads under fire, proving that combat engineering was as much about courage as it was about mathematics. Her father would have been proud. Would have been. Staff Sergeant Thomas Strand, who'd survived the frozen hell of the Chosin Reservoir in Korea, only to succumb to complications from frostbite damage when Maya was 18, had left her with 2 things: an unwavering belief in service and a spine made of titanium. The K-bar combat knife on her hip, serial number 3847291, issued to him in November 1950, was the only physical reminder she carried. Everything else lived in memory and muscle. The Army had been her way of honoring his ghost. Every mission completed, every life saved, every bridge built under mortar fire was a conversation with the dead, a promise kept to a man who never lived to see her in uniform. Fort Garrison sprawled before her like a small city, all function and purpose, where 30,000 souls moved in synchronized chaos. Somewhere in that organized machine, she would command the motor pool. Not the most glamorous assignment, perhaps, but one that mattered. Vehicles were the lifeblood of any military operation. Without them, even the best trained soldiers became stationary targets. The assignment brief had been clear: take over a motor pool running at 68% efficiency and fix it. Her predecessor had been reassigned after a pattern of equipment failures that nearly cost lives during a combined arms exercise. Maya had 90 days to turn it around. She'd done harder things with less time and worse odds. What the brief didn't mention was the new commanding officer who'd just been assigned to Fort Garrison, Colonel Victor Marlowe. The name meant nothing to her then. It would mean everything soon enough. She reported to base headquarters that afternoon, her dress uniform pressed to knife-edge precision, her bearing military perfect. The clerk at the front desk, a specialist who couldn't have been more than 23, directed her to the 3rd floor, Colonel Marlowe's office. Protocol demanded she check in with the installation commander within 24 hours of arrival. The hallway leading to his office was lined with photographs. Fort Garrison's history in black and white and faded color. Men in various uniforms spanning decades, their faces serious, their eyes distant with the weight of decisions made and lives spent in service. Only men. The observation registered without judgment, simply fact. The military had been a masculine domain for most of its existence. That was changing, slowly, stubbornly, against the current of tradition in the weight of culture. Maya knocked twice on the heavy oak door. A voice from within, clipped and authoritative, told her to enter. Colonel Victor Marlowe sat behind a desk that could have doubled as a landing strip, its surface almost aggressively organized. Every paper aligned, every pen in its place, The computer monitor angled precisely 90 degrees to the desk's edge. The man himself matched the environment. 55 years old with silver threading through close-cropped hair, his uniform bearing the kind of perfection that came from 33 years of habit. His face was weathered but strong, the kind of face that looked like it had been carved rather than born. All sharp angles and hard planes. His eyes, when they met hers, were gray and cold as January. Behind him on the credenza sat photographs spanning his career. A young private in 1988, the tail end of the Cold War. A sergeant in Desert Storm, 1991, standing beside a destroyed Iraqi tank. A captain at some tropical posting, maybe Honduras or Panama. A major at the Pentagon. A lieutenant colonel at Fort Hood. Each photo showed Marlowe surrounded by other soldiers. All men, all white, all cut from the same cloth of an army that no longer existed, but lived on in memory and preference. One photo stood out. Marlowe shaking hands with a senator whose face Maya recognized from cable news. Political connections, the kind that could accelerate a career or protect it from consequences. Captain Strand, not a question, a statement. He didn't stand, didn't offer his hand. You're assigned to motor pool operations. Yes, sir. Maya remained at attention, her salute crisp and held until he returned it with minimum effort. Your predecessor left the unit in substandard condition. Marlowe leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in front of him. I expect rapid improvement. This installation doesn't tolerate mediocrity. Understood, sir. I've reviewed the efficiency reports and have a 90-day implementation plan. I didn't ask for your plan, Captain. His voice remained level, almost pleasant, but the words landed like stones. I asked for results. You're dismissed. The meeting lasted less than 3 minutes. Maya saluted again, executed a perfect about-face, and left. Only later, walking across the base toward her new quarters through heat that shimmered off asphalt, did the strangeness of the encounter settle in. She'd commanded operations in combat zones. She'd neutralized improvised explosive devices with hands steady enough to thread needles. She'd earned commendations from generals and respect from soldiers who initially doubted her. And yet Colonel Victor Marlowe had looked at her like she was a problem waiting to happen. She shook it off. Some officers were like that. Old school, all business, testing new arrivals to see what they were made of. She'd won over harder men than him. What Maya didn't know, couldn't have known that afternoon, was that 3 years earlier, Colonel Marlowe had sat on her promotion board. The board that determined whether Captain-select Maya Strand would receive her railroad tracks or remain a first lieutenant indefinitely. The vote had been close. 2 in favor, 1 against. Marlowe's vote had been against. His written justification, buried in classified personnel files. Lacks command temperament suitable for leadership in high-pressure environments. Recommend additional seasoning before promotion. The 2 other board members had disagreed. Maya had made captain. But Marlowe's opinion hadn't changed, and now she was on his installation, under his command, in a position where he could prove himself right. The motor pool complex sat on the eastern edge of Fort Garrison, a sprawling network of maintenance bays, equipment yards, and administrative buildings that hummed with constant activity. M1151 HMMWVS, the armored variant of the high-mobility, multi-purpose wheeled vehicle, in various states of repair. M35 cargo trucks with their hoods yawned open like hungry mouths. M88 recovery vehicles, massive and brutish, designed to drag disabled tanks off battlefields. The smell of diesel, in grease, and oil hung in the air like incense in a mechanic's cathedral. Maya felt immediately at home. Sergeant Daniel Cross was waiting for her outside Bay 1. 38 years old, 18 years in service, with hands that bore the scars of 1,000 repairs, and shoulders that looked like they could carry twice his weight. He'd been running the motor pool in the interim between commanders, and his expression suggested he wasn't thrilled about relinquishing control. "Captain," he saluted without enthusiasm. "Welcome to the motor pool." "Sergeant Cross." Maya returned the salute and extended her hand. He hesitated for just a moment before shaking it. His grip was firm, testing. She matched it without trying to prove anything. "I've read your service record. Impressive. I'm going to need your expertise to turn this place around." Something shifted in his face. Not quite approval, but recognition that she'd done her homework. "Records say you did 2 tours in Afghanistan. EOD work. Explosive Ordnance Disposal. Yes, and vehicle maintenance under combat conditions. I've rebuilt TH-400 transmissions in 120-degree heat with mortars landing 200 yards out. I know my way around an engine, Sergeant." Cross's eyes narrowed, reassessing. "We've got 15 mechanics. Good men, most of them. Equipment's old, budget's tight, and we're running about 68% operational readiness." 68, according to last month's report. Maya pulled out a tablet, called up the data. "But that's aggregate. Your M1151 fleet is at 59%. Your M35 cargo trucks are at 73. Your M88 recovery vehicles are at 75. That tells me we've got a prioritization problem, not a capability problem." Cross's eyebrows rose slightly. She'd surprised him. "Good. How long have you been here, Sergeant?" "This posting? 4 years. The Army? 18. Then you know these vehicles better than I do. I'm not here to tell you how to do your job. I'm here to remove obstacles so you can do it better. Show me what you need." They spent the next 3 hours walking every bay, inspecting every vehicle, Maya asking questions that demonstrated she knew exactly what she was looking at. By the time the sun started its descent toward the horizon, Sergeant Cross was answering with genuine respect instead of grudging compliance. The other mechanics, initially watching with skeptical eyes, began to warm incrementally. She didn't talk down to them. She didn't pretend to know more than them. She asked good questions and listened to the answers. And when Specialist Marcus Rivera explained a diagnostic issue with a 6.5-liter Detroit diesel engine, Maya rolled up her sleeves and helped him trace the fuel injector problem with hands that moved with the confidence of experience. As evening fell and the mechanics secured their bays for the night, Maya stood in her new office, a cramped space with a government-issue desk and a window overlooking the motor pool, and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Day 1, complete. The team was skeptical but not hostile. The challenge was real but not insurmountable. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Coffee tomorrow, 0700, off base, the grind on Bragg Boulevard. We should talk. FC." FC. The initials meant nothing to her, but the confidence of the message, the assumption that she'd know who it was, suggested someone who expected to be obeyed. She almost deleted it, then curiosity won. She replied, "Who is this?" The response came immediately. "A friend of your father's, and someone who knows Fort Garrison better than you think." Maya stared at the phone for a long moment. Thomas Strand had been dead for 16 years. His friends would be in their late 60s, early 70s now. Korea War veterans, the ones who'd survived. A dying generation, their numbers dwindling with each passing year. She typed, "I'll be there." The Grind was a local coffee shop that catered to soldiers who wanted to escape base for an hour, civilians who didn't mind military clientele, and anyone seeking caffeine strong enough to strip paint. Maya arrived at 6:45, early out of habit, and claimed a corner booth with clear sight lines to both entrances. At exactly 700, a man walked in who commanded attention without trying. Late 60s, maybe 70, but moving with the upright posture of someone who'd never forgotten his military bearing. 6 feet tall, lean in the way that suggested discipline rather than deprivation. His civilian clothes, khakis and a polo shirt, couldn't hide what he was, what he'd been, what he'd always be. He walked directly to her booth. "Captain Strand, thank you for meeting me." "You have me at a disadvantage, sir." Frank Carver, he extended his hand. His grip was firm, warm, the handshake of a man who'd spent a lifetime leading others. Retired, so you can skip the "sir," though I appreciate the courtesy. Maya's mind raced through her father's stories, searching for the name. It clicked. General Carver, 1st Marine Division, Chosin Reservoir. A smile crossed his weathered face. Your father talked about me? He talked about Korea, about the reservoir, about the men who held the line when the Chinese came. She paused. He said there were officers who led from the front, and then there were leaders men would follow into hell because they knew the leader would go first. He said you were the second kind. Carver's smile faded into something more complex. Gratitude, maybe, or grief for battles fought 7 decades past. Your father was one of the bravest men I ever served with. 20 years old, surrounded by 10 divisions of Chinese infantry, temperature 40 below zero, and Tom Strand held his position for 16 hours while we evacuated the wounded. He paused. I owed him my life 3 times over. When I heard his daughter was assigned to Fort Garrison, I thought I should reach out. How did you know I was here? I make it my business to know what happens on this installation. I may be retired, but I still have friends in the command structure, friends who share my concerns. Concerns about what? Carver glanced around the coffee shop. A few civilians, a couple of junior enlisted soldiers, no one within earshot. Still, he lowered his voice. About Colonel Marlowe, about the pattern of behavior he's established over 5 years in 3 different postings, about what happened to 7 female officers who had the misfortune of serving under his command. Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach. I don't know what you're talking about. You will. Carver pulled out a small leather notebook, the kind officers used to carry before everything went digital. He opened it to a marked page. Major Diana Chen, forced out after filing a harassment complaint at Fort Carson, 2019, now working as a defense contractor because the Army made her career untenable. He turned the page. Captain Rebecca Moore resigned 18 months ago after Marlowe systematically undermined her authority at Fort Hood. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Torres, still serving but stuck in a career-dead staff position after crossing Marlowe at the same posting. Another page. Major Jennifer Kim, Major Amanda Foster, Captain Lisa Bennett, Captain Nicole Wright. 7 women. 7 complaints filed through proper channels. 7 complaints investigated by officers who happened to be Marlowe's associates. 7 complaints dismissed as personality conflicts or misunderstandings. He closed the notebook. And 7 women whose careers were destroyed or derailed because they had the audacity to be competent while female. Maya sat very still. Why are you telling me this? Because I saw your father hold the line at Chosin when retreat was the only sane option. Because I know courage is genetic. Because, he paused and something shifted in his expression. Pain, carefully controlled. Because my daughter served in Afghanistan, Lieutenant Sarah Chen. She died in 2019, Kandahar Province, IED strike during a convoy escort mission. The name hit Maya like physical impact. Sarah Chen, the bright-eyed lieutenant who'd been assigned to Maya's engineering platoon for 3 months in 2019. Whip-smart, fearless, funny even under fire. She transferred to a different unit for a special assignment. 2 months later, the casualty report had come through. Sarah was, Maya's voice caught. She was one of the best soldiers I ever served with. She talked about you in her letters home. Carver's voice was steady, but his eyes held the permanent grief of a parent who'd buried a child. Said you were the real deal. Said if she could be half the officer you were, she'd count it a success. He looked down at his coffee. 3 weeks before she died, she told me about a captain named Maya Strand who taught her that competence transcends gender, and courage is measured in actions, not words. They sat in silence for a moment. The coffee shop hummed with conversation and the hiss of espresso machines. But in their corner booth, two people connected by loss and duty shared a quiet understanding. "Marlowe voted against your promotion 3 years ago," Carver said finally. "I checked. I still have access to certain files through certain channels." His written justification was professional enough to pass legal review, but the intent was clear. He didn't think you belonged in command. And now I'm at his installation. Now you're in his crosshairs. He's already started the process. I have sources who tell me he's been making calls to division, talking about standards and readiness metrics, building a narrative about whether certain assignments are appropriate for certain officers. Wrong. The word came out harder than Maya intended. Wrong, Carver agreed, but effective. He's patient. He'll spend months documenting minor issues, manufacturing concerns, creating a paper trail that justifies whatever action he wants to take. By the time you realize you're being targeted, the case against you will be complete. So what do I do? What your father did at Chosin, what Sarah did in Kandahar, what every soldier does when facing a superior force. Carver met her eyes. You hold the line. You make your motor pool so efficient, so well run, so undeniably excellent that when Marlowe comes for you, and he will come for you, the contrast between his accusations and your actual performance will be impossible to ignore. That might not be enough. It won't be. Carver reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wooden box. He set it on the table between them, which is why you need to document everything. Every interaction with Marlowe, every delayed supply requisition, every administrative obstacle. Build your own case while he builds his. Maya looked at the box but didn't touch it. What is this? Your father's Bronze Star. He earned it for valor at Chosin. I've kept it since the Army sent it to me by mistake in '52. Administrative error. They were overwhelmed with casualties. I tracked down your mother a few years after the war ended, meant to return it. She told me to keep it, said Tom would have wanted someone who was there to have it. He pushed the box toward her. But I think he'd want you to have it now. Reminder that standing against impossible odds is in your blood. Maya opened the box. The metal gleamed despite 7 decades, the ribbon still vibrant. She touched it gently, feeling the weight of history and expectation. I can't accept this. You can and you will. Consider it alone. When this is over, when you've held your line, you can decide whether to keep it or pass it on. Carver stood, preparing to leave. One more thing. Marlowe has powerful friends. Senate Armed Services Committee, certain generals at the Pentagon. He's protected in ways that make direct confrontation dangerous. But he's also arrogant. He thinks his position makes him untouchable. Everyone's touchable. That's what Sarah used to say. Carver's smile was sad and proud. Be careful, Captain. Marlowe's not just fighting you. He's fighting the inevitable evolution of an army that's leaving his worldview behind. That makes him dangerous. Cornered animals always are. After he left, Maya sat alone with her coffee and her father's medal, thinking about lines that must be held and battles that must be fought. Outside, Fort Garrison woke to another day of routine and training, unaware that in a small coffee shop, a fuse had just been lit. By week 3, motor pool efficiency had climbed to 75%. The M1151HMMWV fleet, 15 vehicles that were the backbone of transportation operations, had gone from 59% operational to 78%. The secret wasn't magic or innovation. It was fundamentals executed with precision. Maya had identified the core problem within 48 hours. The TH400 automatic transmissions in the HMMWVs were failing because worn clutch packs weren't being replaced during routine maintenance. The 3 to 4 clutch pack, specifically, showed heat scoring from friction material slippage. It was a $15 part that cost $10,000 in towing and repair when it failed catastrophically. In Bay 3, she showed Private Ethan Hayes how to diagnose the problem. Hayes was 22 years old, fresh from mechanic school, and terrified of senior officers in general and failure in particular. But when his hands touched tools, something changed. His nervousness evaporated, replaced by focus that bordered on meditative. See the scoring here? Maya pointed to the clutch pack they'd removed from an M1151's transmission. Heat damage. The friction material wore down to 0.065 inches when specs call for 0.08 minimum. Once it gets this thin, metal contacts metal, generates heat, warps the pack. Hayes examined it closely, his fear forgotten in the presence of mechanical truth. How do you catch it before failure? Diagnostics. The HMMWV's OBD2 system throws a code, P0735, gear ratio incorrect for fifth. Most mechanics see that and think software glitch, clear the code, move on. But it's actually telling you the clutch pack is slipping. So we check every code, even the intermittent ones, especially the intermittent ones. Those are the vehicle talking to you, telling you what's about to break. She handed him the torque wrench, 15 to 20 foot-pounds on the valve body bolts. No more, no less. Too tight, you crack the casting. Too loose, you get hydraulic leaks. Hayes set the torque wrench with careful precision, his hands steady. Maya watched him work, seeing not what he was, but what he could become. The Army was full of kids like Hayes, uncertain, under-leveraged, waiting for someone to see past the nervousness to the potential underneath. Sergeant Cross appeared in the doorway of Bay 3. Captain, you've got a supply requisition issue. Maya wiped her hands on a shop rag. What kind of issue? The TH-400 rebuild kits you ordered. Requisition number 4782. Should have been approved in 48 hours per standard protocol. It's been 10 days, still showing pending. Who's the approval authority? Logistics, Captain Wolf's office. Captain James Wolf. Maya had met him once, briefly, at a staff meeting. Mid-40s, career logistics officer, and from his body language and tone, someone firmly in Marlowe's orbit. I'll handle it. She turned back to Hayes. Finish this rebuild. When you're done, test drive it yourself. I want you to feel the difference between a properly functioning transmission and the garbage we've been accepting as good enough. Hayes nodded, already refocusing on the valve body. Maya found Captain Wolf in his office, a space dominated by filing cabinets and requisition forms organized with the obsessive precision of a man who measured his worth in properly processed paperwork. Captain Wolf, I'm checking on requisition 4782, TH-400 rebuild kits. Wolf barely looked up from his computer. Pending review. It's been 10 days. Standard approval timeline is 48 hours for parts under $500 per unit. These kits are $350. Budget constraints require additional scrutiny. The budget was approved in August. There's no constraint, there's delay. Now Wolf looked up, his expression cooling. Captain Strand, I've been processing requisitions at this installation for 6 years. I understand the approval process better than you do. I understand transmissions, Captain, and I understand that every day without those kits, I've got HMMWV's sitting deadline that should be operational. That impacts mission readiness. That's something Colonel Marlowe cares about deeply, according to his welcome speech. Wolf's jaw tightened. I'll review your requisition when I have time. Was there anything else? Maya held his gaze for 3 seconds, long enough to make a point, short enough to avoid insubordination. No, thank you for your time, Captain. She left the office knowing the requisition would remain pending. This wasn't about budgets or procedures. This was about establishing that she existed at someone's discretion, that her success could be throttled or enabled based on factors having nothing to do with competence. She pulled out her phone and opened a notes app, creating a new file titled Administrative Actions Chronological. The first entry captured everything: date, requisition number, Captain Wolf's stated reason, and the reality of an approved, unencumbered budget. Every delayed requisition, every obstacle, every piece of a pattern she was building while Marlowe built his. By week 6, efficiency had hit 82% despite the supply chain obstacles. Maya had gotten creative, cross-referencing national stock numbers to find the same parts under different nomenclature, ordering through alternative channels, calling in favors from officers at other installations who owed her from Afghanistan or Iraq. The mechanics, seeing her fight for them, fight with them, began to respond. They stayed late without being ordered. They took pride in their work that went beyond mere compliance. Specialist Marcus Rivera, who'd been phoning in his diagnostics for months under the previous commander, started catching problems before they became failures. And Private Hayes, the nervous kid who'd arrived terrified of his own shadow, began to blossom into the mechanic he'd always had the potential to be. But while Maya was building loyalty among her soldiers, forces were aligning against her in ways she couldn't yet see. Colonel Marlowe received her weekly reports without comment. Her supply requisitions, which should have been routine, continued to languish. When she attended staff meetings, she noticed the way conversation would pause when she entered, the way certain officers exchanged glances she wasn't meant to interpret. Only Major Garrett Cole, the operations officer, treated her like she belonged there. He'd served with her in Afghanistan, had seen her work firsthand, and his respect was genuine and public. After one particularly tense staff meeting in October, where her maintenance protocols had been questioned by 3 different officers, despite their obvious effectiveness, Cole caught her in the hallway. "They're testing you," he said quietly. "Marlowe's got his people. They're watching to see if you'll complain, if you'll make waves, if you'll give them ammunition." "I don't complain," Maya said. "I document." Cole smiled slightly. "Smart. Keep doing that. But Strand, be careful. This isn't about efficiency numbers or maintenance schedules. This is about something bigger and more personal than either of us wants to acknowledge." "I know." "Do you?" "Because I've seen this pattern before. Different installation, different officer, same playbook. They'll isolate you first. Make sure you don't have allies in the command structure. Then they'll manufacture crises that you can't solve because they control the resources. Finally, when you're frustrated and exhausted, and maybe you make one small mistake, they'll come down on you with the full weight of regulation and protocol." He paused. "And by then, it's too late to fight back." "So what do I do?" "What you're doing. Document everything. Build a case while they're building theirs. And Strand," his voice dropped even lower, "find allies outside the chain of command. Inspector General, JAG, anyone who can provide oversight if this gets ugly." That night, Maya sat in her quarters and created a comprehensive timeline. Every delayed requisition, every pointed question in staff meetings, every instance where her work was scrutinized more harshly than her male counterparts. She backed up the files to 3 different locations: her personal laptop, an encrypted cloud server, and a physical thumb drive she mailed to her mother in Maryland with instructions to keep it somewhere safe. Insurance, evidence, ammunition. The incident that crystallized everything happened in early November. Maya had developed a predictive maintenance algorithm. Nothing fancy, just a database that tracked vehicle diagnostic codes against maintenance history and used basic statistical analysis to predict failures 72 hours in advance. It was efficient, it was effective, and over 6 weeks it had saved Fort Garrison an estimated $2.4 million in repair costs and lost operational time. She'd submitted the innovation through proper channels, recommending it for adoption across the installation's entire vehicle fleet. The potential cost savings were substantial. The implementation complexity was minimal. It was the kind of force multiplier idea that should have been approved immediately and held up as an example of junior officer initiative. The recommendation was rejected without explanation. Maya requested clarification from the reviewing board. The response, signed by Colonel Marlowe himself, was 2 sentences. "Upon review, the proposed system does not meet current operational requirements. No further action required." She showed the rejection to Sergeant Cross, who read it twice and set it down carefully, like it might explode. Permission to speak freely, ma'am? Always, Sergeant. That's horseshit. We've proven this system works. Every deadline we've avoided, every vehicle that stayed operational because we caught the problem early, that's real-world validation. I know. Then why? He stopped, understanding settling across his face. Because you're the one who developed it. Because I'm the one who developed it, Maya confirmed. And approving it would be acknowledging that I bring value beyond just filling a diversity checkbox. Cross was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried an edge Maya hadn't heard before. I've served 18 years, ma'am. 15 different officers in 7 different units. You're the best commander I've ever had. And I'm watching them tear you down for being good at your job. That's not the Army I signed up for. It's the Army that exists, Sergeant. Has been for a long time. Only difference now is some of us are refusing to accept it quietly. That evening, her phone buzzed with a text from General Carver. Need to talk. Same place. Tomorrow. 0700. When Maya arrived at the grind the next morning, Carver was already there, looking grim. I got word through my network, he said without preamble. Marlowe's planning something for March. An inspection. He's coordinating with sympathetic officers to ensure they find problems. My motor pool is running at 89% efficiency. There are no problems to find. He'll manufacture them. Creative interpretation of regulations, subjective assessments of standards, whatever it takes. Carver leaned forward. But here's the key detail. He wants an audience. He's scheduling it to coincide with morning formation. 800 soldiers will have clear sight lines to your motor pool. The strategic calculation was clear and cruel. Public humiliation followed by administrative action. By the time anyone realized what happened, Maya would be reassigned to some nowhere posting, and Marlowe would have proven his point. So I have 4 months to prepare. 4 months to make your motor pool so perfect he can't find legitimate violations. And when he manufactures them anyway, 800 witnesses will see the truth. Carver's expression softened slightly. I know what I'm asking. I'm asking you to walk into an ambush with your eyes open. What would Sarah do? The question hung between them. Carver's daughter, who'd driven routes in Afghanistan, knowing IEDs could be anywhere, who'd done her job despite the fear because the job needed doing. Sarah would stand her ground. His voice was rough with grief and pride. Sarah would say that if you only fight battles you know you can win, you're not fighting for anything that matters. Maya thought of her father at Chosin, surrounded by Chinese divisions and killing cold, holding a position because someone had to. She thought of her own tours in Afghanistan, making the long walk to render safe explosive devices, while everyone else retreated to minimum safe distance. Some battles you fought because retreating meant letting evil win by default. Then that's what I'll do. She met Carver's eyes. I'll hold the line. Over the next 4 months, Captain Maya Strand transformed her motor pool from excellent to immaculate. Every tool found its shadowboard position. Every procedure was documented in triplicate. Every soldier knew their role with precision that could execute it sleeping. She implemented the 5S methodology: sort, straighten, shine, standardize, sustain, with religious devotion. Tools were organized not just by type, but by frequency of use. Work areas were cleaned after every job, not at end of shift. Procedures were standardized across all mechanics so anyone could step into any job without hesitation. Private Hayes, who'd started as a bundle of nerves, became one of her best mechanics. She mentored him patiently, building his confidence brick by brick. By January, he could rebuild a 6.5-liter Detroit diesel engine to specification without supervision, his hands steady and sure. How did you get so good at this, ma'am? He asked one day while calibrating fuel injectors to 1,000th inch tolerance. Afghanistan, Maya said. You learn fast when mortars are landing and you've got a convoy deadline that can't slip. But mostly, Hayes, I'm good at this because someone taught me it mattered. My first platoon sergeant, guy named Morrison, he told me that 99% good enough gets people killed. You want 100% every time, or you want to be the one writing letters to families explaining why their soldier didn't come home because a fuel injector was 0.003 inches out of spec. Hayes's hands didn't waver. 100%, ma'am. Then that's what you give, every time. She also did something else, something that existed in a gray area of regulations but felt necessary. She ordered a body camera, Axon Body 3, civilian grade, 1080p HD with 142-degree field of view. It clipped to her belt, small and unobtrusive. Every interaction, every meeting, every moment on duty was captured, encrypted, and uploaded to a secure cloud server located off base. If Marlowe was going to come for her, she'd have evidence, video evidence, time-stamped, authenticated, unimpeachable. By March, motor pool efficiency had climbed to 98%, a number that should have been impossible with their aged equipment and limited budget. All 15 M1151 HMMWVs were operational. 28 of 30 M35 cargo trucks were ready. All 4 M88 recovery vehicles could deploy on zero notice. Every vehicle service record was perfect. Every tool was calibrated and certified. Every procedure was triple documented. Maya had built a fortress. Now she waited for the siege. The night before the scheduled inspection, March 14th, 2023, Maya called her mother. Sarah Strand, 78 years old and sharp as ever, listened to her daughter's carefully edited version of events. "You sound like your father before he deployed to Korea," Sarah said quietly. "Calm. Too calm. What's really happening, Maya?" "I have a difficult commanding officer. It's going to come to a head tomorrow." "Difficult how?" "The old-fashioned kind of difficult, Mom. The kind who thinks women belong in support roles, not command positions. The kind who's going to try to prove I don't belong." Silence on the other end. Then, "Your father used to say that courage isn't not being afraid. It's being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. Are you afraid?" "Yes." "Good. Fear keeps you sharp, but don't let it make you small. You've earned your place. Remember that." After the call, Maya sat at her desk and wrote a letter. Old-fashioned pen on paper, sealed in an envelope addressed to Major Garrett Cole. The instructions were simple. To be opened only if I'm court-martialed or worse. The letter contained everything. The rejection of her maintenance algorithm, documentation of every delayed requisition, every biased interaction, references to the files she'd backed up in multiple locations, her testimony, written while she could still write it freely, insurance, legacy, proof. She locked it in her desk's bottom drawer, then sat alone in the darkness of her office, thinking about the moment her father had given her his Korean War service medal. She'd been 17, a year before he died, already talking about military service despite his reservations. "This medal doesn't mean what you think it means," he'd said, pressing the cold metal into her palm. "It's not about heroism. It's about showing up when showing up was hard. About doing your job when your job was impossible. About standing when everyone else wanted to run. That's what service is, Maya. The choice to stand." Tomorrow she would stand. She tried to sleep but couldn't. Instead, she lay in darkness, staring at ceiling shadows, thinking about lines that must be held and prices that must be paid. Thinking about her father at Chosin and Sarah Chen in Kandahar and all the soldiers who'd gone before, making the hard choice when the hard choice was all that remained. At 0430, she gave up on sleep and dressed in her uniform with ceremonial care. Every crease perfect, every button aligned. Her ribbons, Afghanistan Campaign Medal, Iraq Campaign Medal, EOD badge, precisely placed. The body camera clipped to her belt, already recording. She arrived at the motor pool at 600, 2 hours before the scheduled inspection. Her soldiers were already there, all 15 of them, checking and rechecking equipment that didn't need checking, cleaning what was already clean. Nervous energy crackled through the air like static electricity. "Listen up," Maya called them to attention. They gathered in a semicircle, these men who'd become something more than subordinates. "Whatever happens today, whatever you see or hear, maintain your bearing. Stay professional. Let your work speak for itself. This motor pool is the best on installation. You've made it that. Nobody can take that away. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am." The response was sharp, unified, defiant. At 0745, soldiers began forming on the parade ground adjacent to the motor pool. Morning formation, standard procedure, nothing unusual. Except today, those hundreds of pairs of eyes would have clear view of the motor pool entrance. Today, morning formation had an ulterior purpose. Maya watched them assemble through her office window. Row after row of soldiers in perfect alignment, their faces forward, their bearing military exact. Somewhere in those ranks was General Carver, she knew. Somewhere in those ranks were allies she didn't know she had. And somewhere in those ranks were people who agreed with Marlowe, who thought she didn't belong, who would cheer her downfall. She checked her body camera one final time. Recording, battery full, cloud backup active. At precisely 0800 hours, Colonel Victor Marlowe's vehicle pulled up to the motor pool entrance. The fuse had burned down to nothing. The explosion was about to begin. Colonel Victor Marlowe emerged from his vehicle with the bearing of a man who had never questioned his own authority. His uniform was pressed to razor sharpness, his posture military perfect despite 55 years of gravity. Behind him, 6 junior officers spilled out of a second vehicle, their faces carefully neutral, their notebooks already open. An inspection party, an execution squad dressed in army green. Maya stepped out of her office to meet them, her salute crisp and held until Marlowe returned it with mechanical precision. No warmth in his eyes, no acknowledgement beyond what protocol demanded. "Colonel, motor pool ready for inspection, sir." "We'll see about that, Captain." His voice carried across the open space, loud enough for nearby soldiers to hear, loud enough for the formation on the parade ground to catch fragments. This was intentional. Everything about this moment was choreographed. The inspection began with administrative records. Marlowe and his officers crowded into Maya's small office, pulling files, examining maintenance logs, scrutinizing every piece of documentation with the intensity of men looking for treasure or evidence. Maya stood at attention, answering questions with facts, providing context where needed, her voice level and professional. The body camera on her belt captured everything, every word, every expression, every moment of this theater. 30 minutes in, they'd found nothing. Her records were immaculate, every vehicle accounted for, every maintenance cycle documented, every safety protocol followed to the letter and beyond. She could see frustration building in Marlowe's face, a tightness around his eyes, a compression of his lips. He'd expected easy targets. He'd expected sloppiness that could be magnified into incompetence. Instead, he was finding a unit that ran like precision machinery. "Let's inspect the vehicles," he said abruptly, standing so quickly his chair scraped against concrete. "That's where problems hide, not in paperwork, in actual operations." They moved outside, the inspection party fanning out across the motor pool like a search team. On the parade ground, 847 soldiers watched with growing interest. Morning formations should have started already, but someone had delayed it. Someone wanted those soldiers watching. The first bay held 5 M1151 HMMWVs in various stages of maintenance. Marlowe approached the nearest one, running his hand along the hood, checking for dust that wasn't there. He peered into the engine compartment, the 6.5-liter Detroit diesel gleaming under fluorescent lights, looking for oil leaks or loose connections or any sign of mechanical neglect. Nothing. The vehicle was immaculate. He moved to the second HMMWV, then the third. Each time the same result. These machines were maintained with the kind of care that spoke to pride in work, to soldiers who gave a damn. This wrench, Marlowe pointed to a tool resting on a workbench. It's 3 inches out of position according to the shadow board. Maya glanced at the shadow board on the wall, where the outline of every tool was painted so mechanics knew exactly where each item belonged. The 3/4-inch combination wrench was indeed slightly offset from its designated position. Yes, sir. Sergeant Cross was using it 5 minutes before your arrival. Standard protocol allows tools to be off shadow during active maintenance periods. They're returned to position at end of shift. I didn't ask about protocols, Captain. I asked about standards. Marlowe's voice had an edge now. If a wrench can be out of place, what else is out of place? It was a nothing violation. The kind of nitpick that would never be noted in a normal inspection. But this wasn't a normal inspection. They moved through 3 more bays. Marlowe found a paint touch-up on an M35 cargo truck that was allegedly the wrong shade. Forest Green 383 instead of Forest Green 383A. Though Sergeant Cross quietly confirmed they were the same color from different manufacturers, same federal specification. He found a lubricant log that had an entry from yesterday instead of this morning. He found a parts inventory that listed items by serial number in ascending order instead of alphabetical order by item name. Each finding was technically accurate. Each was also meaningless. These were not safety violations, not readiness issues, not anything that affected the motor pool's 98% operational efficiency. They were pretext. The junior officers in Marlowe's party dutifully wrote down each observation, their pens scratching against paper with sounds that felt like accusations. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed eager, sensing blood in the water. Maya maintained her composure, responding to each criticism with calm explanations, offering to correct issues immediately, never arguing but never conceding that these minor deviations represented actual problems. Her body camera captured everything, every word, every expression, every moment of this performance. They reached Bay 4 where Sergeant Daniel Cross was overseeing a transmission rebuild. Cross snapped to attention as the inspection party approached, his mechanics following suit. 18 years of service had taught him how to read officers, and what he read on Marlowe's face made his jaw tighten imperceptibly. Sergeant, explain this maintenance procedure. Marlowe gestured at the disassembled TH400 transmission on the workbench. Cross launched into a detailed technical explanation, his voice steady, his knowledge absolute. Sir, we're rebuilding the 3 to 4 clutch pack per technical manual 9-2320-387-34, current revision. Torque specifications are 15 to 20 foot-pounds on valve body bolts. Clutch pack clearance 0.060 to 0.080 inches. The procedure incorporates improvements from recent Army technical bulletins that reduce long-term failure rates by 40%. He spoke with the confidence of a man who knew his craft, whose hands had rebuilt hundreds of transmissions, who could diagnose problems by sound alone. Marlowe listened with the expression of someone waiting for a mistake. When Cross finished, the colonel's response came like a slap. That's not how we did it when I was working on vehicles. Your method wastes time, valuable time that could cost lives in a combat situation. Sir, with respect, Maya interjected, the method Sergeant Cross describes is current doctrine. It actually saves time in the long run by preventing recurring problems. We have data showing... Data. Marlowe's voice dripped contempt. I have 33 years of experience, Captain. That trumps your data. The junior officers shifted uncomfortably. Major Patterson, one of Marlowe's deputies, opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Whatever he'd been about to say died unspoken. They moved to Bay 5. Private Ethan Hayes was there, working on a 6.5-liter Detroit diesel engine rebuild. His tools organized with obsessive precision, his movements careful and methodical. At 22, he still got nervous around senior officers, and the arrival of the inspection party made his shoulders tense visibly. Marlowe zeroed in on that tension like a predator spotting weakness. "Private, are you nervous because you're incompetent or because you know you're about to be discovered?" Hayes's face went white. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The young soldier's eyes darted to Maya, pleading for rescue. "Sir, Private Hayes rebuilt 18 engines this month with 0 defects." Maya kept her voice measured but firm. His nervousness stems from being in the presence of senior officers during an inspection, not from incompetence. Once he's working, his hands are steady as a surgeon's. "Did I ask for your assessment, Captain?" "Sir, as his commanding officer, I'm responsible. You're responsible for this disaster of a motor pool." Marlowe's voice rose, carrying clearly now beyond the bay walls. Soldiers on the parade ground heard those words. 847 witnesses to what was becoming less an inspection and more an inquisition. Hayes stood frozen, his face cycling through emotions: fear, confusion, shame. He was 22 years old and had done nothing wrong except be nervous. And now his commanding officer was being publicly berated for defending him. Sergeant Cross took a step forward, his face hard. Other mechanics in the bay stopped working, attention shifting from engines to the drama unfolding in their midst. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees with rising tension. Marlowe turned his attention fully to Maya now, abandoning all pretense of inspecting equipment. This had always been about her. The motor pool was just the battleground. "Captain Strand, your incompetence endangers American lives. This unit, under your command, fails to meet the standards of the United States Army." "Sir, our operational readiness is 98%. That's the highest on installation. Our maintenance protocols exceed—" "I don't care about your numbers. Numbers can be manipulated. I care about real readiness. And what I see here is a unit that cuts corners, that prioritizes appearance over substance, that lacks the discipline necessary for combat operations." Every word was calculated, every accusation designed to wound while remaining just vague enough to avoid specific rebuttal. But Maya had played this game before, in different contexts with different antagonists. She knew the pattern, the escalation, the baiting. "Sir, I respectfully request we continue this discussion in private. I can provide detailed documentation." "Private? So you can run to your equal employment opportunity friends? So you can cry about how unfairly you're being treated?" Marlowe's voice climbed another notch. "No, Captain, this ends now. This ends here." He turned to address the mechanics scattered throughout the bay. 15 soldiers who had spent months under Maya's command, who knew exactly what kind of leader she was, who understood that what they were witnessing had nothing to do with motor pool efficiency. "How many of you," Marlowe asked, his voice echoing off concrete walls, "how many of you have requested transfers out of this unit because of Captain Strand's leadership?" Silence. Complete, absolute silence. Not one hand moved. Not one soldier spoke. They stood at attention, their eyes forward, their faces carefully blank. But their stillness was its own answer. No one wanted to leave. No one had complained. This unit, despite everything, was exactly where they wanted to be. The refusal to validate his accusations seemed to snap something in Marlowe. Color rose in his face, a flush spreading from collar to hairline. He'd expected compliance. He'd expected at least one soldier to raise a hand, to give him the opening he needed. Instead, he'd received unified silence that spoke louder than any words. "Sergeant Cross," Marlowe spun on the senior NCO, "you've served 18 years. You've seen real leadership. Is Captain Strand truly fit for command?" Cross didn't hesitate. "Sir, Captain Strand is the best commander I've served under in 18 years. Every man here would follow her anywhere." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Cross had just contradicted his commanding officer in front of witnesses. Career suicide, normally, but the sergeant's face showed no regret, only determination. Marlowe's face darkened further. Sergeant, you're relieved of duty pending investigation of your judgment and fitness for your position. Then relieve me too, sir. Corporal Marcus Rivera took a step forward. Because I agree with Sergeant Cross. And me, another mechanic stepped forward. Me too, a third. Within seconds, all 15 mechanics in the bay had stepped forward, forming a loose line between Marlowe and Maya. Not threatening, not aggressive, just present, standing, refusing to let their captain face this alone. It was mutiny, not in the traditional sense, not refusing orders or abandoning posts, but a collective statement that transcended protocol. These soldiers were declaring, through position and presence, whose leadership they trusted, and it wasn't the colonel's. The situation was spiraling beyond Marlowe's control. What should have been a simple inspection, followed by administrative action, had become a public confrontation with battle lines drawn. Soldiers on the parade ground were watching now without pretense. They'd abandoned formation to crowd closer, to see and hear what was happening. Officers were supposed to stop them, restore order, but even the officers seemed paralyzed by the unprecedented nature of what was unfolding. Marlowe's hands clenched into fists. His breathing came shallow and rapid. Every muscle radiated barely contained fury. He'd spent 4 months planning this moment, coordinating with sympathetic officers, manufacturing justifications. And it was all collapsing because soldiers refused to cooperate with their own commander. Captain Strand, his voice dropped to something quieter but infinitely more dangerous. This is what happens when we let diversity hires command soldiers. This is what happens when political correctness overrides military readiness. You are a walking example of lowered standards. The accusation cut through the bay like a blade. Diversity hire. The implication was clear. She hadn't earned her position. She was there to fill quotas, to satisfy politicians, to make the Army look progressive regardless of actual competence. Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not fear, not shock. She'd heard variations of this accusation her entire career. Sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, always carrying the same message. You don't belong. But this time was different. This time, it was on record. This time, 847 soldiers heard it. This time, there could be no walking it back, no claiming misunderstanding, no bureaucratic burial. Sir, her voice remained level despite the adrenaline flooding her system. I am formally filing a sexual harassment complaint. Multiple witnesses present. Your comments constitute discrimination based on gender and are in direct violation of. Marlowe's laugh was harsh and ugly. You want to see harassment? He grabbed the inspection clipboard from one of his officers and hurled it, not at Maya, but at the ground near her feet, where it clattered and skidded across concrete. Papers scattered like frightened birds. Pick it up. Not a request, a command. Pick it up, Captain, that's an order. The bay went absolutely still. Every soldier understood what was happening. This wasn't about the clipboard. This was about power, about forcing submission, about making Maya kneel, literally or figuratively, to prove his authority over her. Maya looked at the scattered papers, looked at Marlowe, looked at the 847 soldiers watching from the parade ground. Multiple recording devices captured it all. The thrown clipboard, the order, the context that made it something far more than a simple directive. Sir, I will not comply with an order I believe to be unlawful and inappropriate. That's insubordination, added to your growing list of failures. Private Hayes, who'd been standing frozen this entire time, couldn't take it anymore. The young soldier's voice cracked as he spoke. Sir, please. Captain Strand has done nothing wrong. She's the best officer I've ever. Shut your mouth, Private. Marlowe moved toward Hayes with sudden violence, closing the distance in 3 quick steps. His hand came up, not yet striking, but the threat implicit in the motion. Hayes stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his toolbox. Maya's training kicked in before conscious thought. 12 years of combat operations, of threats assessed and neutralized, of split-second decisions that meant life or death. She moved between Marlowe and Hayes, placing herself physically as a barrier, her body language defensive, but her presence absolute. "Sir, step back." Marlowe's hand was still raised, frozen in mid-motion. For a moment, 3 full seconds, they stood like that, the colonel's hands suspended in air, Maya between him and the young private, 847 soldiers holding their collective breath. And then Marlowe's hand moved. The motion was fast, driven by fury and frustration, and 4 months of planning gone wrong. His palm swung toward Maya's face in what could charitably be called an aggressive gesture, and realistically described as an attempted strike. Whether he meant to actually hit her or just intimidate her would be debated later. In the moment, it didn't matter. Maya's body responded with muscle memory encoded through thousands of hours of training. Her eyes tracked the incoming hand. Her brain calculated trajectory, velocity, threat level. Her conclusion formed in microseconds. Imminent assault. Response authorized. Neutralized threat. She moved with precision that came from expertise rather than thought. Her hands shot up, intercepting Marlowe's wrist with both palms. Her grip locked around the joint, fingers finding pressure points with anatomical accuracy. She pulled his arm forward, using his own momentum against him, while simultaneously stepping back and rotating her torso 45 degrees. The technique was textbook Krav Maga, the Israeli combat system taught to military personnel for close-quarters self-defense. Applied correctly, it redirected an attacker's force, used their body weight against them, and created joint locks that controlled without requiring superior strength. Applied correctly, it also caused pain, significant pain. Maya continued the motion, pulling Marlowe off balance while twisting his wrist beyond its natural range of motion. The colonel, expecting to make contact with her face, found himself suddenly moving forward with nothing to stop his momentum. His body tilted, his feet scrambled for purchase that wasn't there. And then came the sound, the crack of breaking bone carried across the motor pool bay with crystalline clarity. A sharp report that momentarily drowned out every other noise. Marlowe's radius snapped cleanly, 2 inches above the wrist, the bone giving way under combined forces of torque and leverage and basic physics. The colonel's face transformed from rage to shock to pain in an instant. His legs gave out. He dropped to his knees, cradling his right arm against his chest, his mouth open in a perfect O of pain and disbelief. No sound came out for 3 full seconds. Then a groan, low and animal, forced its way through his throat. Maya released his wrist immediately and stepped back to a position of attention, her hands at her sides, her face professionally neutral. The entire sequence, from Marlowe's aggressive motion to his collapse, had taken less than 4 seconds. 4 seconds that 847 soldiers witnessed. 4 seconds captured on body cameras, smartphone videos, and the recording devices of investigators who stood somewhere in that crowd. 4 seconds that would change everything. The silence that followed stretched impossibly long. 1,000 people frozen in a tableau of shock, their faces reflecting various stages of processing what they'd just seen. The base commander on his knees, arm broken by a captain he'd been inspecting. The physics of it were simple. The implications were catastrophic. Then sound returned like a wave, gasps, murmurs, the rustle of 847 soldiers shifting position, turning to neighbors, seeking confirmation that they'd really seen what they thought they'd seen. Sergeant Cross moved first, dropping to one knee beside Marlowe, combat medic training overriding everything else. He examined the arm without touching it, noting the angle, the swelling already beginning, the way Marlowe cradled it. "Sir, you need medical attention. Don't move the arm. I'm calling for an ambulance." Marlowe's eyes, when they focused on Cross, were glazed with pain and something else. Humiliation. Defeat. The understanding that whatever he'd planned, however he'd imagined this morning unfolding, it had gone catastrophically wrong. His voice, when he managed to speak, was thick with effort. "Arrest her! Arrest Captain Strand! Assault on a superior officer! She attacked me!" "Sir," with respect, Major Garrett Cole materialized from somewhere, moving through the crowd of mechanics with purpose. "I witnessed the entire incident. Captain Strand was defending Private Hayes from your aggressive advance. When you moved to strike her, she employed defensive techniques. She did not initiate contact. I don't care what you witnessed. I'm giving you an order, Major. Arrest that woman." Cole looked at Maya, his face carefully composed. "Captain, I'm going to need you to come with me, not under arrest, for your protection and to preserve the integrity of what's going to be a very complicated investigation." Maya nodded. "Yes, sir, I'll cooperate fully." "Sir," one of the junior officers in Marlowe's inspection party, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, stepped forward. "Sir, we need to get you to the hospital. And sir, I have to advise you that anything you say right now could be problematic. You should wait for legal counsel." The concern in Morrison's voice wasn't for Marlowe's well-being. It was for his legal exposure. Smart officers could see the writing on the wall. This wasn't going to be a simple assault charge against a subordinate. This was going to be an investigation into what led to that moment. And the 847 witnesses complicated any narrative Marlowe might try to construct. The base ambulance arrived within minutes, medics hustling through the crowd with practiced efficiency. They immobilized Marlowe's arm with an inflatable splint, administered 10 milligrams of morphine intravenously, loaded him onto a stretcher with careful movements that still drew hisses of pain. As they wheeled him toward the ambulance, his eyes found Maya one last time. The hatred in that gaze was pure and absolute. This wasn't over, not for him. Even broken, even beaten, even facing an investigation that could end his career, Colonel Victor Marlowe was already planning his next move. Maya walked beside Major Cole toward base headquarters, her bearing military perfect despite what had just happened. Behind them, the soldiers who'd witnessed everything slowly dispersed. But not before many pulled out phones, to text, to call, to share what they'd seen. The story was already spreading beyond Fort Garrison's gates, carried on digital wings to social media platforms and news outlets and military message boards. Within an hour, videos would surface, smartphone footage from a dozen angles showing Marlowe's aggressive advance, his raised hand, Maya's defensive response, the moment of breaking. The quality would be shaky, the audio sometimes unclear, but the essential truth would be obvious to anyone watching. A commanding officer had attacked a subordinate. The subordinate had defended herself, and the Army was about to have a very public conversation about power, abuse, and the cost of speaking truth to authority. Maya was placed in a conference room at headquarters, not locked but under guard. Standard procedure for someone involved in an incident requiring investigation. Cole had brought her water, a notepad, and advice delivered in a quiet voice. "Write down everything, every detail from the moment you arrived this morning to the moment his arm broke. Timeline, quotes as close as you can remember them, witnesses, evidence. Everything, Maya, because they're going to come at you with everything they have." They? Marlowe has allies, officers who think like him, who believe the military is better off the way it used to be. They'll try to spin this as insubordination, as a subordinate attacking a superior. They'll ignore context. They'll minimize his behavior. They'll make you the villain. Cole met her eyes. But there are witnesses, 847 of them, and half of them will be pressured to remember it differently, or to suddenly become uncertain about exactly what they saw, or to decide it's not worth risking their careers over. "What about the IG investigator you mentioned?" Cole's expression flickered with something that might have been satisfaction. "Already filing a report, but even that won't make this simple. You broke a full bird colonel's arm, Maya. That's not something the Army takes lightly, justified or not. She spent the next 8 hours writing. Every conversation with Marlowe from her arrival at Fort Garrison, every delayed requisition, every pointed comment in staff meetings, the pattern of behavior that led to this morning, the inspection itself, minute by minute, Hayes's fear, Cross's defense, the 15 mechanics standing together, Marlowe throwing the clipboard, the order to pick it up, his advance on Hayes, the raised hand, the defensive response. Her hands cramped from writing, but she didn't stop. This was her testimony, her version before it could be shaped or edited or contradicted. The truth documented while it was still fresh. Outside the conference room, Fort Garrison churned with activity. The base commander was in surgery to set his broken arm. The Inspector General's office was interviewing witnesses. The Public Affairs Office was being inundated with media requests. And in barracks and dining facilities across the installation, soldiers were having urgent conversations about what they'd seen and what it meant. Some supported Maya. She defended herself and a subordinate from an abusive commander. She'd done exactly what they were trained to do: assess threats, respond proportionally, protect the vulnerable. Others were horrified. She'd struck a superior officer, broken his arm, shattered the chain of command, set a precedent that could lead to chaos if subordinates thought they could use violence against commanders they disagreed with. But most, the vast majority of those 847 witnesses, fell somewhere in between. They understood that what they'd seen was complicated, that Marlowe had been wrong, but Maya's response had been extreme, that both things could be true simultaneously, that he'd provoked the confrontation, and that she'd ended it with force that, while arguably justified, carried consequences neither of them could escape. As afternoon turned to evening, Maya remained in that conference room, writing and waiting. Her recording devices had been seized as evidence. Her phone was taken. She was isolated, alone with her thoughts and her testimony, and the growing certainty that her career, regardless of how this investigation ended, would never be the same. The door opened. Major Cole entered, carrying coffee and a sandwich she hadn't asked for but desperately needed. Preliminary witness statements are in. Out of 847 who were present, 632 are saying Marlowe was the aggressor. 94 are saying you attacked unprovoked. The rest claim they didn't see clearly enough to say. 632. Maya let the number sink in. That's more than I expected. It's overwhelming. But Maya, it won't be enough to stop this from going to court-martial. You're going to be charged. And so is he. Dual prosecution. United States versus Captain Strand and United States versus Colonel Marlowe. Simultaneous trials, possibly combined. She took a sip of coffee, felt it burn going down, welcomed the sensation of something real and immediate. How long until charges are filed? 72 hours probably, maybe sooner if pressure from above accelerates things. The Pentagon's involved now. This is national news. Female officer breaks commanding officer's arm after public confrontation. Every outlet is running with it. Different spins, different angles, but everyone's talking about Fort Garrison today. So what happens now? Now, Cole set his own coffee down and looked at her with something approaching sympathy. Now it gets worse before it gets better. Now the lawyers start crafting narratives. Now your life gets picked apart by people who've never served, never faced a situation like you faced, never had to make a split-second decision with hundreds of people watching. He paused. Now, Captain Maya Strand, you prepare for the fight of your life. Maya finished writing her statement as night fell over Fort Garrison. The last lines were simple, direct, true. I do not regret defending myself in Private Hayes. I followed my training. I used proportional force. I acted in accordance with my oath to protect those under my command. If faced with the same situation, I would make the same choice. I am a soldier. I did my duty. She signed it, dated it, and handed it to Cole. Outside, 847 soldiers were trying to sleep, replaying what they'd seen, wondering what would come next. Somewhere in a hospital room, Colonel Victor Marlowe lay with his arm in a cast, planning his revenge and his defense. And across America, people were reading headlines and watching videos, informing opinions about a confrontation they didn't fully understand. But in that conference room, Maya Strand felt something unexpected. Not fear, not regret, relief. The tension of 18 months, the weight of knowing conflict was coming, the exhausting effort of staying professional under systematic assault, all of it released in 4 seconds of decisive action. She'd stood up. She'd fought back. She'd broken more than just bone. She'd broken the silence, the pattern, the cycle of abuse that relied on victims staying quiet. Whatever came next, she'd face it standing tall, the way her father taught her. The machinery of military justice moves with deliberate precision, grinding slowly but comprehensively, leaving nothing unexamined in its wake. For Captain Maya Strand, the 72 hours following the confrontation passed in a blur of interrogations, legal consultations, and enforced isolation that felt more like quarantine than protection. She was confined to quarters, allowed contact only with her appointed defense counsel and Major Cole in his official capacity as witness coordinator. The rest of Fort Garrison continued its operations around her, but she existed in a bubble of legal limbo, waiting for charges that everyone knew were coming. They came on the 4th day. Formal notification delivered by a stone-faced captain from the Judge Advocate General's office, reading from a document with the clinical detachment of a coroner announcing cause of death. Captain Maya Strand was hereby charged under Article 128 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice with assault on a superior commissioned officer. Maximum penalty, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and 10 years confinement. The same day, in a hospital room across base, Colonel Victor Marlowe received his own notification. Multiple charges: assault under Article 128, conduct unbecoming an officer under Article 133, conspiracy to violate rights under Article 93A, and creating a hostile work environment. Maximum combined penalty: dismissal from service, forfeiture of all retirement benefits, and 24 months confinement. The Army, facing unprecedented public scrutiny and pressure from Congress, had decided to prosecute both. Let a court-martial sort truth from accusation. Let military justice demonstrate its impartiality. Let the evidence speak louder than the competing narratives already fracturing public opinion. The media firestorm exceeded anything Fort Garrison's Public Affairs Office had prepared for. Within 24 hours of the incident, smartphone videos had circulated to every major news outlet. Cable networks ran the footage on loops, freeze-framing the moment Marlowe's hand moved toward Maya. The instant her defensive technique engaged, the crack of breaking bone you could almost hear through shaky video compression. Conservative commentators decried the breakdown of military discipline. Progressive voices hailed Maya as a hero, standing up to systemic abuse. Veterans groups split along generational and ideological lines, their debates growing heated in social media threads and cable news panels. The story had everything modern media craved: institutional power dynamics, gender politics, military culture clash, and dramatic video evidence. Hashtags proliferated. The confrontation at Fort Garrison became a Rorschach test, revealing more about observers' pre-existing beliefs than about the actual event. Through it all, Maya remained silent. Her defense counsel, Colonel Janet Pierce, was a 52-year-old JAG officer with a reputation for aggressive advocacy and zero tolerance for bureaucratic intimidation. She'd built her career defending soldiers accused of crimes in combat zones, navigating the murky intersection of warfare and law, and she'd never lost a case where evidence supported her client. She took one look at the body camera footage, the witness statements, and Marlowe's documented pattern of harassment, and told Maya something unexpected. "We're not just defending you, we're putting the system on trial." The legal strategy was audacious. Pierce planned to argue that Maya's actions weren't merely justified self-defense, but the inevitable result of institutional failures that forced her into an impossible situation. The Army had ignored complaints, enabled harassment, and created conditions where violence became the only language Marlowe understood. By prosecuting Maya while simultaneously prosecuting Marlowe, the military was admitting both officers had legitimate grievances, which meant the system itself bore responsibility. "They want this to be about one bad colonel and one defensive captain," Pierce explained during a strategy session in her office, surrounded by law books and case files stacked like fortifications. "We're going to show them it's about decades of cultural rot that your confrontation finally exposed. Every delayed requisition, every ignored complaint, every female officer who was forced out rather than fight back, all of it becomes evidence." The investigation expanded rapidly. Inspector General teams descended on Fort Garrison like archaeological excavators, carefully brushing away layers of accumulated cover-up to reveal the fossils of institutional bias beneath. What they found was damning. 7 other female officers had filed complaints about Marlowe over 5 years at 3 different postings. Every complaint had been dismissed, downplayed, or resulted in the complainant being reassigned to career-dead positions. The pattern was unmistakable. Marlowe targeted competent women, undermined their authority, and was protected by sympathetic senior officers who shared his worldview. One of those 7 women, Major Diana Chen, had left the Army entirely after Marlowe engineered her removal from a battalion command position at Fort Carson in 2019. She'd been replaced by a less qualified male officer whose primary credential was not threatening Marlowe's conception of proper military hierarchy. Chen, now working as a defense contractor, agreed to testify. So did 4 of the other 6. Their stories varied in specifics but shared common themes: competence questioned, work scrutinized beyond standard, professional isolation, and ultimate retaliation when they pushed back. But the investigation also uncovered something Maya hadn't known about. 3 weeks after the confrontation, a letter arrived at Pierce's office. Handwritten on plain paper, no return address, postmarked from a civilian mailbox in Fayetteville. The letter was from Captain Michael Torres, who'd served as Marlowe's aide for 3 years before resigning his commission 2 months prior. The confession was simple and devastating. Torres had made the USB recordings that had mysteriously appeared on Maya's desk. He'd watched Marlowe destroy careers, had participated in the machinery of retaliation, and finally couldn't stay silent anymore. "Watching General Carver visit Captain Strand was the final straw," Torres wrote. He'd lost his daughter to combat, and here was another officer trying to destroy a woman Sarah Chen had admired. "I couldn't be part of it anymore. I'm a civilian now, so they can't retaliate against me. Use the recordings, tell the truth." The revelation gave Pierce additional ammunition, but it also complicated things. Torres had recorded his commanding officer without consent, potentially illegally. The recordings might be inadmissible, but they'd already served their purpose, alerting Maya to the threat, allowing her to prepare, creating a documented trail of Marlowe's intent. The prosecution, led by Major William Foster, faced a challenge unlike any he'd encountered in 15 years as a JAG prosecutor. His case against Maya should have been straightforward. She'd broken a superior officer's arm. Physical assault on a commissioned officer was among the most serious offenses in military law, designed to preserve the chain of command that held military structure together. But the video evidence was problematic. Marlowe's aggressive advance, his raised hand, the defensive nature of Maya's response, and those 847 witnesses, most of whom would testify that Marlowe was the aggressor. Foster's strategy became clear during pretrial motions. Focus on the technical aspects of the law while minimizing context. Yes, Marlowe had been inappropriate. Yes, he'd created a hostile environment, but those were separate issues requiring separate adjudication. Maya had used force against a superior officer, and regardless of provocation, that force violated the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The law was the law. Exception couldn't be made, even for sympathetic circumstances, without undermining the entire foundation of military discipline. It was a defensible position, legally sound, morally complicated. The court-martial convened in May 2023, 2 months after the confrontation, held in Fort Garrison's largest courtroom to accommodate the unprecedented media presence in public interest. The military judge was Colonel Marcus Reed, a 30-year veteran with a reputation for strict adherence to law, tempered by genuine concern for justice. Two additional officers completed the panel. Lieutenant Colonel Amanda Price, who'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Bradford, an armor officer with minimal combat experience but extensive legal training. The courtroom packed beyond capacity. Media representatives filled designated press seats, their laptops and recording devices creating a technological hum beneath formal proceedings. Military lawyers from across the JAG Corps attended to observe what many considered a landmark case. And in the back rows, as many of Maya's soldiers as could get leave sat in uniform, their presence a silent statement of support. Maya entered wearing her dress uniform, every ribbon precisely placed, her bearing confident despite the charges that could end her career in freedom. She'd lost weight during the 2 months of investigation, the stress carving away anything non-essential until only determination remained. Her mother sat in the family section. Sarah Strand, 78 years old but ramrod straight, her eyes fierce with protective anger. She'd raised her daughter to stand tall. Now she would watch that daughter face judgment for doing exactly that. General Frank Carver sat 3 rows behind Sarah, wearing his full dress uniform with Korea War ribbons that drew respectful glances from younger officers. He'd told Maya before the trial began that he'd be there every day, a promise to his daughter's memory and to the soldier who'd honored that memory. Marlowe arrived in civilian clothes, his right arm still casted, the injury a visible reminder of why they were all assembled. His lawyers had advised against uniform, arguing that appearing as a wounded officer might generate sympathy. He looked diminished somehow, smaller than he'd seemed during the inspection, his authority stripped away, leaving only a middle-aged man facing consequences. The prosecution's opening statement was clinical. Major Foster outlined the charges, established that Maya had indeed caused Marlowe's injury, and argued that military discipline required accountability regardless of circumstance. Captain Strand's career prior to March 15th was exemplary, Foster told the panel, his tone respectful toward Maya, acknowledging her service record while insisting that good soldiers who made bad choices still face justice. Her service in Afghanistan and Iraq demonstrated courage and competence. But on March 15th, she made a choice. When faced with a difficult situation, she chose violence, not de-escalation, not withdrawal, not any of the numerous nonviolent options available to her. She chose to physically assault her commanding officer, breaking his arm and ending any possibility of resolving their professional differences through proper channels. He paused, letting the words settle. The law is clear. Assault on a superior officer is a crime. Captain Strand committed that crime. The circumstances may be mitigating. They are not exculpatory. Pierce's opening statement was a declaration of war. She spent 25 minutes detailing Marlowe's pattern of harassment, presenting evidence of delayed requisitions and ignored complaints, and arguing that the Army had created the very situation it now sought to punish Maya for escaping. Colonel Marlowe didn't inspect Captain Strand's motor pool on March 15th, Pierce stated, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. He executed a premeditated plan to destroy her career, a plan he'd spent 18 months developing, a plan that violated every principle of leadership and honor this uniform represents. Captain Strand didn't assault him. She defended herself and her soldiers from an officer who'd gone beyond inappropriate conduct into criminal behavior. She turned to face the panel directly. The prosecution wants you to focus on 4 seconds of physical contact while ignoring 18 months of systematic abuse. That's not justice. That's complicity. The trial proceeded with a measured pace of military legal proceedings. Each witness examined and cross-examined. Each piece of evidence scrutinized from every angle. The body camera footage was played repeatedly, analysts offering frame-by-frame breakdowns of movement and intent. Medical experts testified about the nature of Marlowe's injury, confirming that the break pattern was consistent with a defensive redirection of force, rather than an offensive attack. The angle and location of the fracture told a story. Maya had controlled and neutralized a threat, not initiated violence. Private Ethan Hayes testified with visible nervousness, his voice cracking as he described Marlowe's intimidation and Maya's protection. Under cross-examination, Foster tried to establish that Hayes had misinterpreted Marlowe's intent, that the colonel was merely conducting a demanding but appropriate inspection. Hayes didn't budge. "Sir, I know what an inspection looks like. I know what harassment looks like. What Colonel Marlowe did that morning wasn't about checking if we maintain vehicles properly. It was about humiliating Captain Strand in front of hundreds of soldiers. And when she wouldn't be humiliated, when she defended me from his anger, he tried to hit her." Sergeant Daniel Cross's testimony was devastating to the prosecution. 18 years of service gave him credibility that couldn't be impeached, and his assessment of both officers was unequivocal. "I've served in combat zones, sir," Cross told the panel. "I've seen soldiers make split-second decisions under fire. Captain Strand did exactly what we're trained to do. Identify a threat, assess options, respond with minimum necessary force. If that had been an enemy combatant moving aggressively toward her, nobody would question her response. The fact that it was her commanding officer doesn't change the physics or the justification." The 7 women who'd previously filed complaints against Marlowe testified over 3 days, their stories painting a portrait of an officer who used rank as a weapon against subordinates he deemed unsuitable. Major Diana Chen, whose testimony was expected to be impactful, proved even more powerful than anticipated. She described in clinical detail how Marlowe had manufactured a command climate assessment that portrayed her as divisive and ineffective, despite objective performance metrics showing the opposite. When she'd filed a complaint, the investigating officer had been one of Marlowe's longtime associates. The complaint was dismissed as personality conflict. 6 months later, Chen was reassigned to a logistics desk job that effectively ended her operational career. "I had 2 choices," Chen told the courtroom, her voice steady, but her eyes reflecting old pain. "Keep fighting and watch my career die slowly, or resign with some dignity intact. I chose resignation. Captain Strand chose to fight. I wish I'd had her courage." But then came a moment no one had anticipated. As Pierce prepared to call her next witness on the trial's 4th day, a woman in civilian clothes stood from the gallery seats. "Your Honor, permission to approach." Colonel Reed, surprised but intrigued, granted permission. The woman walked forward with the bearing of someone who'd made a difficult decision and committed fully to it. "I'm Captain Rebecca Hall. I resigned my commission 18 months ago because of Colonel Marlowe." Her voice carried clearly, steady despite obvious emotion. "I filed complaints. They were buried. I was told to be grateful for my career and stop making trouble. So I left. But I'm not leaving this courtroom until everyone knows what he did." Before Reed could respond, 5 more women stood. Different ages, different ranks, some still in uniform, others in civilian clothes, all wearing the haunted look of people who'd fought battles no one acknowledged. "We're the ones who stayed silent," one said, a lieutenant colonel who still served. "Captain Strand is the one who fought back. We're here to make sure her fight wasn't for nothing. The courtroom erupted. Media scrambled for cameras. Reed called for order, his gavel cracking like thunder. And Marlowe, watching ghosts from his past materialize to testify against him, seemed to age 10 years in 10 seconds. Reed restored order after a full minute of chaos. "Captain Hall, you're not on the witness list. Neither are these other officers. However, given the extraordinary nature of this development, I'm going to allow preliminary statements. Colonel Pierce, you'll have 24 hours to prepare these witnesses properly." What followed was 3 days of testimony that expanded the case from individual grievance to systemic indictment. 12 women total, spanning 5 years and 3 military installations, all targeted by Marlowe, all failed by the complaint system, all forced to choose between careers and dignity. Their collective testimony created an undeniable pattern. This wasn't about personality conflicts or misunderstandings. This was about an officer who'd spent years weaponizing his authority against women he considered unsuitable for military service, protected by a network of sympathetic officers who'd buried complaints and retaliated against complainants. Foster's cross-examination of these witnesses focused on establishing that their experiences, while regrettable, were separate from the assault charge against Maya. Pattern evidence of Marlowe's behavior might be relevant to his trial, but it didn't excuse physical violence against him. The law against assaulting superior officers existed precisely to prevent subordinates from taking justice into their own hands when they felt mistreated. "Major Chen, did you ever strike Colonel Marlowe?" Foster asked. "No, sir." "Did you break any superior officer's arm?" "No, sir." "Yet you managed to maintain your career for 6 additional months and eventually resign on your own terms. So physical violence wasn't necessary for you. Why was it necessary for Captain Strand?" The question hung heavy. Pierce objected, arguing that the situations were incomparable, but the point had been made. Other officers had endured Marlowe's harassment without resorting to violence. What made Maya different? The answer came during Maya's own testimony. She took the stand on the trial's 9th day, her composure absolute despite knowing that every word would be analyzed, weaponized, or defended depending on perspective. Pierce led her through a chronological account: arrival at Fort Garrison, initial meeting with Marlowe, the pattern of obstruction and harassment, the USB drive evidence, the inspection itself, and finally those 4 seconds that changed everything. "Walk us through your decision-making in that moment," Pierce requested. "Colonel Marlowe's hand was moving toward you. What were you thinking?" Maya's answer was precise, unemotional, the testimony of a soldier trained to articulate tactical decisions. "I assessed 3 factors simultaneously. First, Colonel Marlowe had just moved aggressively toward Private Hayes, establishing his willingness to use physical force. Second, his hand was moving on a trajectory toward either my face or Private Hayes behind me. Third, his body language and elevated stress indicators suggested he wasn't in full control of his actions." She paused, ensuring the panel was following. "Given those factors, I concluded that physical contact was imminent and potentially harmful. My training dictates that in such situations, you don't wait to be hit. You neutralize the threat using minimum necessary force." "Could you have stepped away?" "Negative. Private Hayes was directly behind me. Stepping away would have exposed him to Colonel Marlowe's aggression." "Could you have verbally de-escalated?" "I attempted verbal de-escalation multiple times during the inspection. Colonel Marlowe was beyond reach of verbal intervention. His actions demonstrated that. So in that moment, with Private Hayes behind you and Colonel Marlowe's hand moving toward you, what were your options?" "Except being struck, which would have demonstrated to hundreds of watching soldiers that abuse of authority was acceptable, or defend myself using the techniques I was trained to employ. I chose defense." Foster's cross-examination was surgical. He forced Maya to admit she had Krav Maga training, that she knew her techniques could cause injury, that she chose to apply a wrist lock known to be painful and potentially damaging. He established that Marlowe, at 55 and with no recent combat training, posed less physical threat than enemies she'd faced in Afghanistan. He questioned whether her response was truly proportional or whether it reflected accumulated frustration seeking outlet. Captain Strand, isn't it true that you were angry at Colonel Marlowe? Yes, sir. Angry about the delayed requisitions, the difficult inspections, the professional obstacles? Yes, sir. And when his hand moved toward you, didn't that anger influence your response? Didn't you perhaps unconsciously welcome the opportunity to physically strike back at someone who'd been making your life difficult? Maya met his eyes directly. Sir, if I'd wanted to hurt Colonel Marlowe, I could have done far worse. My training includes techniques that would have resulted in permanent disability or death. I chose a wrist lock that neutralized the immediate threat with minimal injury. The break was unfortunate, but not intentional. I used exactly the amount of force necessary to protect myself in Private Hayes, nothing more. The answer was good, but couldn't fully dispel the question. Had accumulated harassment primed Maya to respond with more force than absolutely necessary? The panel would have to decide. The prosecution's case against Marlowe was, if anything, even more damning. The pattern of complaints and his response to them demonstrated systematic abuse of authority. Character witnesses called to support him were few, and their testimony lukewarm. Officers who should have defended him instead offered carefully worded statements that praised his long service while avoiding endorsement of his leadership style. The most damaging testimony came from Major Kurt Patterson, one of the junior officers who'd accompanied Marlowe on the inspection. Patterson had initially submitted a statement supporting Marlowe's version of events, but under oath and facing perjury charges if he lied, his story changed. He admitted that Marlowe had briefed the inspection party beforehand, telling them to find violations regardless of actual conditions. He acknowledged that the colonel's behavior during the inspection was inappropriate, that Marlowe had initiated physical aggression. His voice shook as he explained that he'd lied initially because he feared career retaliation. I was wrong, Patterson said, his face pale. I should have stopped him. I should have said something when he threw that clipboard, when he went after Private Hayes. But I was afraid, and my cowardice allowed the situation to escalate until Captain Strand had no choice but to defend herself. The trial consumed 3 weeks, generating thousands of pages of transcript and countless hours of testimony. Legal analysts debated fine points of self-defense doctrine. Military lawyers argued about precedent and policy. And across America, people watched a system struggle to balance competing values. Hierarchy versus justice, tradition versus evolution, institutional protection versus individual rights. The panel deliberated for 48 hours behind closed doors. 3 officers wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. The law was clear, but its application was complicated. Both Maya and Marlowe had violated regulations. Both had justifications. Both believed themselves right. How did you weigh systematic harassment against physical assault? How did you balance Marlowe's 33 years of service against his pattern of abuse? How did you evaluate Maya's split-second decision against the sanctity of military hierarchy? On May 28th, the panel returned with verdicts. The courtroom was silent enough to hear breathing as Colonel Reed read from the findings, his voice steady, but his expression suggesting the weight of what he was announcing. In the case of United States versus Captain Maya Strand, on the charge of assault on a superior commissioned officer, we find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Spectators gasped, applauded, shouted objections. Reed's gavel cracked like thunder, restoring order after 30 seconds of chaos. Maya remained standing at attention, her face showing no emotion despite the relief flooding her system. Her mother, in the family section, covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming. General Carver, sitting behind Sarah, closed his eyes briefly, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or thanks. Reed continued reading. The panel finds that Captain Strand's actions constitute lawful self-defense under Article 128. Her response to Colonel Marlowe's aggressive advance was proportional, necessary, and executed in protection of herself and Private Hayes. Military rank does not grant immunity from assault, nor does it obligate subordinates to accept physical abuse. Captain Strand is fully exonerated and restored to duty without prejudice. The statement was clear, comprehensive, and would establish precedent for future cases. The military was formally acknowledging that hierarchy had limits, that self-defense transcended rank, that competent officers could not be targeted for traits unrelated to performance. The panel's findings regarding Marlowe were equally unequivocal. Guilty on all charges. The evidence of systematic harassment, abuse of authority, and conspiracy to violate rights was overwhelming. His injury, while regrettable, was the direct result of his own criminal behavior. The panel recommended maximum punishment, dismissal from service, forfeiture of all pay and retirement benefits, $4,200 monthly pension, lost forever, and 18 months confinement. Marlowe's face, as the verdict was read, cycled through disbelief, rage, and finally, hollow acceptance. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, his retirement gone. Everything he'd built over 33 years collapsed in minutes because he couldn't accept that competence had no gender. Reed added a final statement before dismissing the court. This trial has exposed systemic failures in how the military addresses harassment and discrimination. Captain Strand should never have been forced into a situation where physical self-defense became necessary. The fact that she was represents institutional negligence. This court recommends comprehensive review of complaint procedures, mandatory implicit bias training for all officers, and independent oversight of discrimination investigations. We must do better. The courtroom emptied slowly, spectators reluctant to leave a moment they recognized as historic. Maya was surrounded immediately by her defense team, her mother, General Carver, and several of her soldiers who'd attended the trial. Sergeant Cross gripped her hand without words, his expression saying everything necessary. Private Hayes, who'd grown substantially in confidence during the trial, saluted her with parade ground precision. Outside the courthouse, media swarmed, shouting questions and thrusting microphones toward anyone associated with the case. Pierce had prepared a brief statement on Maya's behalf, thanking the panel for their courage and calling for the policy reforms Reed had recommended. Maya herself said nothing, walking to her vehicle surrounded by a protective cordon of soldiers who'd served under her command. The aftermath unfolded rapidly. Within 72 hours, the Secretary of the Army announced the Strand Protocols, a comprehensive reform package addressing the systemic issues exposed by the trial. All discrimination complaints would now be investigated by independent review boards with no connection to the accused chain of command. Retaliation against complainants became a criminal offense with mandatory minimum punishment. Implicit bias training became required annually for all officers. Whistleblowers received protections so robust that career retaliation became virtually impossible. The 12 women who testified about Marlowe's harassment were all offered reinstatement or redress. 7 accepted various forms of compensation or career adjustments. 5 had moved beyond military careers and declined, but they appreciated the acknowledgement that they'd been wronged. Major Diana Chen, watching the verdict from her civilian office, felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for 4 years. Vindication, even delayed, mattered. Maya was promoted to major in a ceremony held on the Fort Garrison Parade Ground, where 847 soldiers had witnessed the confrontation. The promotion was both recognition of her performance and symbolic statement that the Army valued competence over compliance. She was immediately assigned to the Pentagon, where she would help implement the Strand Protocols across all service branches. From victim of the system to architect of its reformation, her trajectory demonstrated how individual courage could catalyze institutional change. 6 months after the trial, Fort Garrison held a dedication ceremony. The motor pool complex was renamed the Major Maya Strand Motor Pool Excellence Center, a permanent reminder of what had happened there and why it mattered. Maya attended, uncomfortable with the honor, but understanding its symbolic importance. Her former soldiers, still running the motor pool with exceptional efficiency, treated the event like a homecoming. They'd stood with her when it mattered. Now they shared her victory. But Maya also insisted on another recognition. At the same ceremony, a memorial plaque was dedicated to Private Ethan Hayes and Sergeant Daniel Cross, honoring their courage in standing up during the confrontation. Chief Warrant Officer Hayes, Maya announced at the dedication, gesturing to the young man who stood at attention nearby, his nervousness replaced by quiet confidence. Graduated top of his class from Advanced Mechanic School and now commands his own maintenance unit. When asked about that March morning, he tells his soldiers the same thing every time. Protecting people is more important than protecting your career. That lesson was worth everything. She turned to Cross, who'd retired after 22 years, but accepted a civilian position as senior instructor at Fort Garrison's motor pool training facility. Sergeant Cross makes sure every new mechanic hears the story of the day 15 soldiers stood together. He tells them, leadership isn't about rank. It's about doing what's right when doing what's right costs you something. The crowd applauded both men, recognizing that Maya's vindication was incomplete without acknowledging those who'd stood beside her. 1 year after the confrontation, Maya received a letter. Standard envelope, no return address, postmarked from a federal correctional facility in Kansas. She opened it with some trepidation, unsure what communication from that source could contain. The letter was handwritten, 2 pages in careful script, signed at the bottom by Victor Marlowe. Major Strand, it began, using her new rank. I have spent 12 months in confinement contemplating the choices that brought me here. The Army provided a psychiatrist who helped me understand that my treatment of you and others stemmed from fear. Fear that the military I understood was changing in ways I couldn't control. Fear that competent women like you would expose the mythology I'd built my identity around. That masculine aggression equaled leadership. That tradition mattered more than effectiveness. That rank justified any behavior. The letter continued, detailing his realization that he'd harmed not just individual officers, but the institution he'd claimed to serve. He acknowledged that his harassment had made the military weaker, not stronger. That true discipline came from respect freely given, not submission coerced through fear. You were the better soldier, Marlowe wrote in conclusion. Better leader, better officer. I spent 33 years in uniform, but you understood service in ways I never did. Your courage in standing up to me, in defending your soldiers, in refusing to be diminished, that's what leadership looks like. I'm sorry for the pain I caused you and the others I targeted. I can't undo the damage, but I can acknowledge the truth. You belonged. You always belonged, and I was wrong to suggest otherwise. Maya read the letter twice, looking for insincerity or hidden agenda, finding only what appeared to be genuine contrition. She didn't respond. Some wounds heal, some don't, and communication wasn't necessary for either outcome. But she kept the letter, filed in a drawer with other documents from that period. Acknowledgement without absolution. Recognition without reconciliation. 2 years after the confrontation, the Strand protocols had been implemented across all military branches. Discrimination complaints were down 37%, not because discrimination had vanished, but because effective procedures prevented situations from escalating to crisis points. Retaliation incidents dropped by 68%, and the number of female officers in command positions increased by 31% as talented women who might have left, rather than fight, found an institution more willing to recognize their competence. Maya, now Lieutenant Colonel Strand, following an accelerated promotion, continued her work at the Pentagon while mentoring young officers navigating the challenges she'd faced. Her office became something of a pilgrimage site for women dealing with difficult command climates, seeking advice from someone who'd survived the worst the system could inflict and emerged not just intact, but triumphant. One afternoon, a young captain named Jennifer Ross knocked on Maya's office door. 26 years old, West Point graduate, currently fighting a harassment complaint against her battalion commander that was going nowhere through official channels. She'd read about Strand's case, studied the trial transcripts, and traveled to the Pentagon, hoping for guidance. Maya gave her 45 minutes and a strategy that would ultimately result in her commander's removal. Document everything, Maya told her, echoing advice she'd once received. Stay professional, even when they're not. Use the Strand protocols. That's what they're for. And remember, you're not fighting for yourself alone. You're fighting for every woman who will come after you. That matters. That's worth the cost. Were you scared? Ross asked as their meeting concluded. When you knew the confrontation was coming? Maya considered the question. Honesty felt important. Terrified, every day for months. But my father once told me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. That wisdom carried me through. And it'll carry you through too. The young captain left with renewed determination, carrying guidance from someone who'd walked the path before her. This, Maya thought, was how culture changed. Not through grand declarations or policy documents, but through individual courage multiplied across thousands of interactions until the exceptional became expected and the impossible became routine. 3 years after the confrontation, on a cold March morning similar to the one where everything changed, Maya returned to Fort Garrison for a speaking engagement. The base had continued its operations, its population cycling through as soldiers deployed and returned and moved to new postings. But institutional memory persisted. New arrivals were told the story of Captain Strand, shown the motor pool that bore her name, taught that standing up to abuse wasn't just permitted, but expected. She stood on the same parade ground where 847 soldiers had watched her defend herself, where witnesses had refused to stay silent, where a moment of violence had catalyzed systemic reform. The ground looked the same, the buildings unchanged, but everything was different. A formation of 500 soldiers stood at attention, listening as Maya delivered a lecture on leadership that had nothing to do with tactics or strategy and everything to do with character. She talked about service, about the choice to stand between danger and those who need protection. She talked about the mechanics who'd stood with her when standing meant risk. She talked about the cost of silence and the necessity of speaking truth, even when truth was dangerous. Service, she concluded, her voice carrying across the parade ground, means standing between danger and those who can't defend themselves. That danger might be enemy soldiers on a battlefield, or it might be abuse of authority in your own institution. Either way, your job is the same. Stand, fight, protect. That's what we wear this uniform for. The soldiers applauded, but Maya barely heard it. She was looking at the motor pool entrance, remembering a moment 3 years past when choice and consequence had merged in 4 seconds of decisive action. She'd stood, she'd fought, she'd broken bone in silence, in the pattern that enabled abuse. And she'd do it again without hesitation, without regret, because some battles had to be fought regardless of cost, because integrity demanded it, because the 847 witnesses and all the women who'd come before her and all who'd come after deserved nothing less than complete, uncompromising courage. The parade ground emptied slowly as soldiers returned to duty. Maya remained a moment longer, feeling March wind that carried memories like voices, hearing echoes of breaking bone and collective gasps and a judge's gavel declaring justice served. Then she turned and walked toward her vehicle, shoulders back, head high, every inch the soldier she'd always been. Behind her, Fort Garrison continued its eternal rhythm. Ahead of her, New challenges waited. But in that moment, walking across ground made sacred by courage, Lieutenant Colonel Maya Strand felt something profound. Peace. The fight was over. Justice had won. And the choice to stand, made in a moment of crisis 3 years ago, had created ripples that would continue long after she was gone. She'd done what her father taught her. She'd stood tall when standing tall was hardest. And that, in the end, was what service meant.